Hello folks and welcome back. I'm recording this video because a thought didn't occur to me at the time that I originally started this series, but there's actually some supplementary material in the manual that came with Jane's USNF 97 that pertains to the campaign. So I'm going to read the portion for Vietnam now. And I'm going to look up the ATF manual later because I actually don't have that one. And I don't think Fighter's Anthology came with a manual because I had what I think was a still unopened copy of that when I bought it recently and didn't have any manual in it. So I'm going to quick read that now, and I'm going to plop that in between the start of the introductory video and the start of the Vietnam campaign. So Chapter 16, page 6. Chapter 6, page 16. Campaign History, Vietnam, 1972. Naval Aviation in the Vietnam Conflict. Precedents. The doctrine of naval aviation developed during World War II and in Korea. During these wars, aircraft launched from carriers provided air support for ground forces in strikes against logistics and industrial targets. Such strikes established the naval carrier's role in the projection of force onshore as well as control of the sea. During the Vietnam conflict, Task Force 77 oversaw carrier operations in the Gulf of Tonkin. Two stations were set up, Yankee Station in the north for strikes against North Vietnam, and Dixie Station to the south for operations in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Naval air participation in the conflict began as early as May 1964 when Yankee team began Navy and Air Force reconnaissance flights over Laos. Shortly afterward, Vietnamese PT boats repeatedly attacked the fleet, and U.S. carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin launched retaliatory airstrikes. In response to the increasing aggression in the Gulf, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution H.J. Congress Res. 1145 in August 1964, announcing the United States' official entry into the conflict as an armed combatant. Rules of engagement. Although the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution sanctioned the use of armed force, strict rules of engagement were in place that changed little until 1972. Keeping civilian casualties to a minimum was a primary concern. Targets were limited to roads, canals, bridges, and petroleum storage facilities, and most cities were protected as restricted areas. The State Department even limited ordnance loads and insisted on perpendicular runs against bridges in an effort to minimize casualties alongside target areas. Such micromanagement often rendered the strikes ineffective. For example, it was practically impossible to destroy a bridge with a perpendicular run as opposed to a run down the center of the bridge. In addition, the attempt exposed the pilots to air defense units commonly located on the riverbanks. Of equal concern was the possibility that the Soviet Union or China might be provoked into openly declaring war on the United States. To minimize this risk, strikes were prohibited in a 30-mile buffer zone along the Chinese border. Chinese ships that fired on aircraft and ships in the Tonkin Gulf were off limits unless they hampered a rescue attempt. Even SAM sites under construction were off limits for fear that the Soviet Union would retaliate if their advisors who were helping to install the sites were hit. Fear of open Chinese and Soviet entry into the conflict prevented strikes that would cut off supply routes at the Chinese border. Likewise, the Haiphong docks, through which most arms entered the country, were off limits because of foreign ships docking there. Once supplies entered Vietnam, they were split up into small shipments, often the size of a single 55-gallon drum, and transported throughout the country on civilian trucks and bicycles. The level of precision required for strikes against such small targets in civilian areas did not exist with the weapon systems at the time. However, laser-guided bombs introduced during the Linebacker phase greatly improved strike accuracy and success. The rules for retaliatory engagement loosened a bit in 1970 when protective reaction strikes, or retaliatory fire against North Vietnamese aggression, were approved. At first, pilots were only allowed to fire after they were fired upon. Later, this rule was amended to allow pilots to fire once an enemy locked up on their aircraft. However, restrictions on preemptive strikes remained largely unchanged until the Linebacker campaigns of 1972 and 1973. Linebacker 1 and 2. By May 1972, 5 Navy carriers, the Constellation, Kitty Hawk, Hancock, Saratoga, and Coral Sea, were stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin. On the 9th of May, A6s and A7s from the Coral Sea began Operation Pocket Money, the mining of the Haiphong Harbor through which 85% of all shipping traffic entered the country. The next day, the first decisive attempt to cut off all supply routes into Vietnam began with the Linebacker 1 campaign. For Linebacker 1, targets and mission objectives were decided by individual units rather than in Washington. The campaign's goal of cutting road and rail lines into China made rail yards, hydroelectric plants, bridges, and even airfields legitimate targets. Between May and September, Navy aircraft from the 5 aircraft carriers flew about 4,000 sorties a month. This heavy air engagement provoked the greatest North Vietnamese air resistance efforts of the war, including the highest number of air-to-air engagements. The unrelenting strikes paid off, however, as supply lines to Vietnam slowed to a near halt. U.S. forces witnessed the obvious drop in supplies. SAM threats became almost non-existent, and AAA went from 85mm barrages to mostly 23mm and 37mm small arms fire. By October, the North Vietnamese government seemed ready to discuss a peace agreement, and strike operations slowed. However, peace negotiations soon ground to a near standstill, and President Nixon authorized the start of Linebacker 2, a massive bombing campaign led by B-52s based in Guam and Thailand, with flak suppression support from Navy carrier aircraft. Peace negotiations were quickly resumed, and in 1973, combat operations in North Vietnam were halted. On January 23rd, representatives of the United States, North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed a ceasefire agreement in Paris, and the United States began a complete withdrawal from Vietnam. Threats that aircraft faced. Anti-aircraft artillery. Although SAMs, which had been first sighted in Vietnam in 1965, were assumed to be the greatest threat to aircraft, anti-aircraft artillery actually destroyed more planes than any other threat in Vietnam. Because of the SAM threat, a shallow-angle, low-altitude delivery was adopted for strike aircraft. This delivery pattern sent planes right into AAA range, but it was believed the gunners wouldn't be able to track the fast jets. In reality, North Vietnamese gunners didn't even bother with tracking. They figured out where the jets were headed and covered the path to the target with as much flak as they could. The jets had to fly through a barrage of 100mm, 80mm, 57mm, 37mm, 23mm, and even small arms fire, which was impossible to completely evade. Smaller caliber guns were extremely mobile, and they were moved quickly to concentrate along sortie routes. Flak suppressors took care of many of the larger guns, but these were easier to replace than SAMs, and were shipped in continuously on freighters entering Haiphong Harbor until the harbor was mined in 1972. Note, in the game campaign, you are extremely vulnerable to small arms fire beneath 4,000 feet, but this does not do as much damage as larger guns. The largest anti-aircraft guns, the 85mm KS-12 and the 100mm KS-19, can destroy you with one shot, but their minimum range is 4,000 feet. Higher value targets will be surrounded by more flak. If you have to fly through flak, get in and get out quickly, for it takes some time for them to target you and fire. If you are flying supersonic or jinking, hit probability is reduced. Surface-to-air missiles. SA-2s had been in operation since the 1950s and were used throughout the Vietnam conflict. Each unit consisted of 4 to 6 launchers and a fire control radar. There were about 200 units in Vietnam by 1972, but only about 35 were operational at any given time. SAMs were continuously moved to hide them from SEAD aircraft. Although not the biggest threat in terms of numbers of aircraft downed, they were certainly a threat for the pilots who encountered them. According to Soviet doctrine, missiles were fired in pairs with a few seconds separation between them. This was a sound strategy, for the first missile was easy to dodge if spotted early enough, but as the pilot avoided it, he lost the time needed to avoid the second missile. SAM invasion tactics and ECM first came into widespread use in the skies over Vietnam. It had been common practice for ECM planes to accompany the strike aircraft, but now ECM pods were attached to individual aircraft to combat both surface-to-air and air-to-air threats. Also, based on experience over Cuba, air wings knew that if they flew in a very tight box formation, radar systems detected them as a single large object. SAMs were automatically aimed at the center of such a target, and often would thus pass harmlessly through the center of the box formed by the aircraft. Note, true to life, SA-2 missiles in the game are not very accurate and are especially vulnerable to jinking. Wait until one gets close, then pull hard on the stick. If you can handle the extra stress of evading SAMs, you might consider flying above maximum AAA range, 25,000 feet, yet still within maximum SA-2 range, 50,000 feet. Air-to-air combat. Only 3.3% of Navy and 9.7% of Air Force aircraft lost were downed by MiGs. However, the overall air-to-air exchange ratio was low. Only 2.5 enemy planes were down for every U.S. pilot down, versus 8 to 1 in World War II and 14 to 1 in Korea. Figures were taken from On Yankee Station, The Naval War Over Vietnam by Commander John B. Nichols, United States Navy, retired, and Barrett Tillman, Naval Institute Press, Annapolis, Maryland, 1987. Other resources include Alpha Strike Vietnam, The Navy's Air War, 1964 to 1973, by Jeffrey L. Levinson, Presidio Press, Naval, California, 1989, and One Day in a Long War by Jeffrey Ethel and Alfred Price, Random House, New York, 1989. Please see the bibliography, page G1, for other interesting books and web addresses. Several factors contributed to this reduced exchange rate. First of all, the playing field was uneven. MAN airfields weren't legitimate targets until late in the war, and the air radar installed in and around them, combined with the Soviet patrol boats in Haiphong Harbor, rendered sneak attacks impossible. MiGs were directed entirely by ground control intercept stations and would generally attack only when they had the advantage. When the advantage shifted, they were ordered to break off and return to the safety of an airbase. Note, if you are flying in the Vietnam campaign, you can get a report of nearby enemy aircraft from an AWACS plane if you're on the American side, or a GCI station if you're on the Vietnamese side, assuming there is one nearby. Press Shift A to locate nearby planes. Position of planes prints at the bottom of your HUD. Second, prior to the Vietnam conflict, only the F-8 Crusader pilots had received advanced combat maneuver training. Advances in long-range weaponry seemed to be making dogfighting skills unimportant, for it was assumed that all engagements would take place from far off. However, air combat in Vietnam proved up close and intense, the most advantageous condition for North Vietnamese MiGs. All MiGs carried cannon, and MiG-21s and some MiG-19s carried short-range infrared homing atoll missiles. Although it lacked afterburners and often radar, a MiG-17 was capable of outmaneuvering an F-4 and was a bit more maneuverable than an F-8 at lower speeds. A MiG-21 could beat an F-4 in a subsonic turning fight, but MiG-21s and F-8s were fairly evenly matched. So once the long-range opportunity was missed, aircraft which relied on long-range weapons, in particular the early model F-4s, which had no internal guns, had a decided disadvantage against their Vietnamese counterparts. In addition, the long-range radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow the Americans carried proved unreliable and ineffective. Visual identification requirements forced pilots to use the missiles at shorter ranges than they were designed for. The missiles required a complex sequence of tracking and locking and were simply ill-suited for intense close combat. Plus, their sophisticated weaponry had a much greater tendency to malfunction than shorter-range IR-guided AIM-9s and cannon. And all Vietnam-era missiles had difficulty tracking when fired during a high-G maneuver or at a target below the horizon. After Vietnam, it became obvious that the F-8 pilots significantly outperformed the rest in air-to-air engagements. They had cannon and shorter-range missiles, but more importantly, they had received training which enabled them to use these weapons effectively in close fighting. Emphasis returned to pilot training, and the Navy established the Fighter Weapons School, otherwise known as Top Gun, in 1969. In the game, as historically, the most common MiG tactic is to approach from behind, fire off a missile or gun rounds, and then leave. MiG-21s will also close at supersonic speeds from astern, fire a missile, and run. They have a small frontal area and are difficult to spot until close. Also, they tend to fly low in an attempt to lure you down into murderous AAA and small arms fire zones. And that is the supplementary material for Vietnam. There's also supplementary material for the other two campaigns, and it's really an interesting manual. It's about an inch or two thick, and it basically walks you through all the theory and physics behind everything in the game as far as flying, and then it explains the various missile guidance systems, sensor modes, tactics, etc. And it's really an interesting read, so I highly recommend it. If anyone does get this game and they're unfortunate enough that they can't get a hard copy with the manual, you can, I believe replacementdocs.com hosts a replacement manual that you can download that is it's very good. It's basically just a scanned copy of the of the original manual that came with the game, and I often use them myself for whenever I need a manual for an old game. And I believe that's it then for this. So I will see you next time.